Whiteness is often seen as a natural identity, but what if it's a social construct? Legal scholar Jacqueline Battalora explores how whiteness was historically created to maintain power. Understanding this helps dismantle racial inequality. It's about recognizing how racial categories have been used to uphold power structures. Jacqueline Battalora, a former police officer turned scholar, examines the invention of whiteness. Her book, Birth of a White Nation, reveals how whiteness was deliberately constructed. She confronts the brutal realities of American history, showing how race was used to maintain control. Battalora's work compels us to confront the legacy of racism today. In the early 1600s, the English colonies had a fluid social hierarchy. Indentured servitude was common for both Europeans and Africans. This shared exploitation fostered solidarity among laborers. The elite saw this unity as a threat and began to divide the laborers to maintain power. Early colonial society was defined by wealth and status, not race. Indentured servants, regardless of race, faced harsh conditions. There was potential for social mobility, but this changed as racial divisions solidified. The transition to a racially defined system curtailed opportunities for upward mobility. Indentured servitude united black and white laborers in shared hardship. This camaraderie threatened the colonial elite's power. Authorities feared uprisings and sought to create divisions among laborers. This strategy aimed to weaken their collective power. The colonial elite feared unrest among laborers. They exploited prejudices to create divisions and control the workforce. This marked the beginning of racialized slavery. The elite's manipulation laid the groundwork for white supremacy. Early colonial interracial relationships blurred racial lines. Children from these unions challenged emerging racial hierarchies. The elite needed to impose order and create clear racial boundaries. This effort aimed to solidify white supremacy. By the 1670s, Virginia's social landscape was volatile. Economic hardship and political instability fueled resentment. The elite exploited labor, creating economic inequality. Discontent among the lower classes set the stage for rebellion. In 1676, Bacon's rebellion united black and white laborers. Led by Nathaniel Bacon, the rebellion challenged the elite's power. It exposed deep social fissures and the potential for interracial solidarity. The rebellion's multiracial composition threatened the established order. The elite feared the unity of black and white rebels. They crushed the rebellion but recognized the threat of interracial solidarity. Preventing future alliances became a priority. Laws were enacted to solidify racial divisions and maintain control. Post-rebellion, the elite sought to divide the lower classes. They created a system that clearly separated white from black. Laws were enacted to enforce white supremacy. This marked a turning point in the development of racial categories. Bacon's rebellion exposed racial fissures and potential solidarity. The elite's response laid the groundwork for white supremacy. The rebellion's legacy highlights the power of racial divisions. Understanding this history helps challenge ongoing systems of oppression. Post-rebellion, the elite codified racial categories. Laws targeted Africans, creating a permanent underclass. These laws maintained white supremacy and controlled colonial life. The legal construction of race ensured continued subjugation of Africans. Section 2. Defining whiteness through exclusion, denying rights and opportunities. The creation of whiteness as a privileged social category was not merely about granting rights and privileges to Europeans and their descendants. It was equally about denying those same rights and opportunities to anyone deemed non-white. This process of defining whiteness through exclusion was central to the establishment of a racial hierarchy that benefited those at the top at the expense of those at the bottom. Colonial laws began to restrict access to land ownership, a cornerstone of economic independence for Africans and their descendants. They were barred from owning property, acquiring land grants, or even inheriting land from white relatives. These restrictions ensured that economic power remained concentrated in the hands of the white elite, perpetuating a cycle of poverty and dependence for generations of African Americans. The denial of education was another key strategy in maintaining white supremacy. Colonial laws prohibited the education of enslaved Africans, fearing that literacy would empower them and challenge the established order. This deliberate denial of education ensured that generations of African Americans would lack the tools and opportunities necessary to compete on an equal footing with their white counterparts. Section 3. The enslavement of Africans, solidifying racial hierarchy through brutality. While the legal construction of racial categories and the denial of rights and opportunities were crucial in establishing white supremacy, it was the brutal institution of chattel slavery that served as its most potent and enduring foundation. The enslavement of Africans, justified by racist ideologies that deemed them inferior and subhuman, cemented the racial hierarchy that would define America for centuries. Colonial laws transformed Africans from indentured servants, who had some limited legal protections and a path to freedom, into chattel slaves, property to be bought, sold, and exploited without mercy. The institution of slavery stripped Africans of their humanity, reducing them to mere commodities to be used and abused at the whim of their white masters. The brutality of slavery, with its physical violence, psychological torture, and the systematic destruction of families and communities, served as a constant reminder of the power dynamics at play. It instilled fear and obedience in the enslaved population while simultaneously reinforcing the supposed superiority of white slaveholders. Section 4. The casualties of whiteness, poor whites, and the price of privilege. While the creation of whiteness undoubtedly benefited the colonial elite, it also had profound and often overlooked consequences for poor whites. By granting them a precarious sense of superiority based solely on their race, the ruling class effectively co-opted them into a system that ultimately served to maintain their own power and privilege. Poor whites, lured by the promise of social mobility and a sense of belonging within the white race, often found themselves trapped in a cycle of poverty and exploitation. The colonial elite, while offering them a modicum of privilege over enslaved Africans, continued to exploit their labor and deny them access to land and resources. The creation of whiteness effectively divided the working class along racial lines, preventing the formation of interracial solidarity that had the potential to challenge the power structure. By pitting poor whites against enslaved Africans, the colonial elite ensured that their own position at the top remained unchallenged. Section 5. A Legacy of Inequality: How Colonial Laws Shaped Modern America. The legal construction of racial categories during the colonial period laid the foundation for centuries of systemic racism and inequality in America. The laws enacted in the wake of Bacon's Rebellion were not merely artifacts of a bygone era, they were the building blocks of a system that continues to shape our society today. The legacy of these laws is evident in the persistent racial disparities in wealth, education, healthcare, and criminal justice. The economic disenfranchisement of African Americans, rooted in centuries of slavery and discriminatory policies, continues to manifest in the racial wealth gap, housing segregation, and limited access to economic opportunities. The historical creation of whiteness as a privileged social category has had a profound and lasting impact on American society. By understanding the roots of racial inequality and the ways in which it has been codified and perpetuated over generations, we can begin to dismantle the systems of oppression that continue to plague our nation and work towards a more just and equitable future for all. the crystallization of racial categories. Before Bacon's rebellion, social divisions were fluid, influenced by land ownership and wealth. Indentured servitude blurred racial lines. Bacon's rebellion united poor whites and enslaved Africans. The elite solidified racial categories to control the workforce. Laws privileged whites, disenfranchising Africans. This racial hierarchy had lasting consequences for America. Section 2. Whiteness as a tool of social control, ensuring obedience and maintaining power. The concept of whiteness, once established, became a powerful tool of social control. By granting poor whites a limited set of privileges and associating those privileges with their racial identity, the colonial elite effectively co-opted them into upholding a system that ultimately benefited those at the top. This strategy, often referred to as the psychological wage of whiteness, proved remarkably effective in maintaining order and quelling dissent. Poor whites, though often subjected to harsh economic conditions and limited opportunities, were nonetheless granted a position of social superiority over enslaved Africans. This sense of superiority, however tenuous, provided them with a psychological boost, a feeling of belonging to a privileged group. This, in turn, made them less likely to challenge the authority of the ruling class or to make common cause with those who were racially defined as other. This manipulation of racial identity effectively divided the working class, preventing the formation of cross-racial alliances that could have threatened the existing power structure. The colonial elite understood that by emphasizing racial differences and fostering a sense of white superiority, they could maintain control over the masses and ensure the continuation of a system that benefited them disproportionately. Section 3. The psychological wages of whiteness, a false sense of superiority and security. The concept of whiteness, while offering no tangible economic or material benefits to poor whites, provided a powerful psychological wage. This wage came in the form of a fabricated sense of superiority, a belief that they, by virtue of their skin color, were inherently better than those categorized as black. This manufactured sense of superiority, while based on a false premise, had a profound impact on the self-perception of poor whites. This fabricated sense of superiority, reinforced through laws, social customs, and cultural narratives, provided a sense of security and belonging, even in the face of economic hardship. It created a social hierarchy in which poor whites, though often struggling to make ends meet, could still view themselves as superior to enslaved Africans, who were denied even the most basic human rights. This psychological manipulation had a profound impact on the development of racial attitudes in America. It fostered a sense of white entitlement and a belief in the inherent inferiority of black people. This ingrained prejudice, passed down through generations, continues to influence racial dynamics in the United States today, highlighting the enduring legacy of a system built on a foundation of racial division and fabricated superiority. Section 4. Legal and Social Codification, Embedding Whiteness into the Fabric of American Society. Once the concept of whiteness was established as a marker of social and legal privilege, it was systematically codified into the very fabric of American society. This codification occurred through a series of laws, social practices, and cultural narratives designed to reinforce the racial hierarchy and ensure its perpetuation for generations to come. Colonial legislatures enacted laws that explicitly granted preferential treatment to white colonists in areas such as land ownership, voting rights, and access to education. These laws, often referred to as black codes or slave codes, served to create a permanent underclass, denying black people the opportunities and freedoms available to their white counterparts. Beyond legal statutes, the concept of whiteness was deeply woven into the social fabric of American life. Social customs and norms dictated strict racial segregation in housing, education, public spaces, and even cemeteries. This segregation served to reinforce the notion of white superiority and black inferiority, further cementing the racial hierarchy in the minds of all members of society. Section 1. The Economics of Whiteness, Building a Nation on Stolen Labor. The construction of whiteness was the bedrock of a new economic order. White superiority was linked to the economic exploitation of black people. The colonial elite built an economic system on unpaid labor. The transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to the Americas. Their forced labor fueled colonial economies. This economic disenfranchisement has lasting consequences today. From plantations to factories, the evolution of economic exploitation. The abolition of slavery in 1865 marked a turning point but did not end economic exploitation. Newly freed black Americans faced economic marginalization. Migrating north, they faced new forms of discrimination in factories. This exclusion solidified economic disparities, creating a persistent racial wealth gap. Section 3. The Legacy of Dispossession, Tracing the Wealth Gap to its Roots. To understand the stark racial wealth gap in America today, one must trace its roots back to the nation's foundations. The economic disenfranchisement of black Americans is not due to individual choices. It is the result of systemic racism and deliberate exclusion. From Reconstruction to 20th century housing policies, black Americans have been denied the chance to build generational wealth. Redlining trapped them in segregated communities. The impact of these policies is staggering. The median wealth of white families is significantly higher. This wealth gap is the result of deliberate policies. Addressing this inequality requires acknowledging its roots and promoting economic justice. The psychological toll of whiteness. Whiteness as a category of privilege came at a steep psychological cost for all involved. It manifests in racial prejudice and fear of losing perceived superiority. White Americans often feel unease and guilt over unearned privileges. This can lead to defensiveness and resistance to addressing systemic racism. The cognitive dissonance of benefiting from inequality while believing in equality causes internal conflict. A culture of silence, the perpetuation of denial and distortion. Silence around race and racism in America allows racial inequality to persist. This refusal prevents meaningful dialogue and hinders progress. It's present in the subtle ways that white Americans deflect or minimize the experiences of people of color. The media often presents a sanitized version of history, downplaying racism's role. Textbooks gloss over the brutality of slavery and the ongoing struggles for racial justice. Confronting the past, transforming the future. Dismantling the legacy of whiteness requires confronting our nation's history and racism's impact. Acknowledge white privilege, understand its roots, and recognize its impact. Break the silence on race and racism. Education is vital in dismantling the legacy of whiteness. Section 1. Unmasking Whiteness, a Call to Action. Jacqueline Battalora's work serves as a powerful reminder that whiteness is not an inherent trait, but rather a social construct meticulously crafted to establish and maintain power. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame or dwelling in guilt. It is about illuminating the mechanisms of oppression that continue to shape our world. By unmasking whiteness, we can begin to dismantle the systems that perpetuate racial inequality and build a more just and equitable society. This journey requires a fundamental shift in perspective. We must move beyond simplistic notions of individual prejudice and confront the systemic nature of racism. It's not enough to simply be not racist. We must actively work to dismantle the structures that perpetuate racial inequality, whether they exist in our institutions, our communities, or within ourselves. Unmasking whiteness is a call to action, an invitation to engage in the ongoing struggle for racial justice. It's a call to educate ourselves and others about the history and legacy of racial categories, to challenge racist language and stereotypes, and to actively work towards creating a society where race is no longer a predictor of opportunity or outcome. Section 2. The Path Forward, Dismantling a Legacy of Oppression. The path forward requires addressing historical, social, economic, and psychological dimensions of racial inequality. It requires truth-telling and confronting uncomfortable truths about our nation's past. We must invest in equitable education systems that teach an inclusive history, dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline and invest in restorative justice practices, address economic disparities exacerbated by discriminatory policies. Invest in affordable housing, quality healthcare, and job training programs. Address the racial wealth gap by supporting Black homeownership and entrepreneurship. Dismantling oppression requires a shift in our collective consciousness. Challenge racist stereotypes and biases, build bridges of understanding and empathy across racial lines, strive for a society where all people are valued and respected.